Hey YouTube, since other people are doing it, I thought I'd show off my Super Nintendo and Super Famicom collection. So here we go. ActRaiser 1. Pretty good early Super Famicom and Super Nintendo game. Battle Clash. Classic Super Scope game. Super Castlevania 4. This is actually a remake of the original Castlevania, but let's not tell anyone. Cool Spot. Remember this guy from 7-Up ads years ago? Cool Spot, yeah. Chrono Trigger. The classic Square game. Donkey Kong Country. The better game, Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Kong Quest. And Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie's Double Trouble. Earthworm Jim, the classic platformer for the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. F-Zero, the original. Now, I did a review of this game a while back, so check out my review. Awesome game. Final Fantasy II, or Final Fantasy IV as it was known in Japan. Final Fantasy III, or Final Fantasy VI as it was known in Japan. Not technically a game, but Game Genie. Gotta love it. The classic cheat device for the Super Nintendo. The Hunt for Red October. The Hunt for Red October. Killer Instinct. I remember I loved this game in the arcade, and I was super stoked to get the Super Nintendo version, which has a black cartridge. Mario Paint, which, in case you don't know, is pretty much like a primitive version of MS Paint for the Super Nintendo. Also has a sound composer. Pretty awesome. Mega Man 7. Now this game is actually really hard to find. Usually goes for at least $50. I got it for about $25, so I lucked out. Mega Man 7. Love it. Mega Man Soccer, one of the more obscure Mega Man games. Yeah, it's Mega Man and the Robot Masters playing soccer with each other. Kind of very strange, actually. Mega Man X. If you don't know this game, this is one of the best games for the Super Nintendo. Buy it. You have to have this. I don't know why it's not for the Wii Virtual Console, but whatever. This game is awesome. Mega Man X2, the follow-up for the Mega Man X series. Mega Man X2 is not Mega Man 11, and Mega Man X is not Mega Man 10. Mega Man X3. This is the last Mega Man X game on the Super Nintendo. It's a pretty awesome game. You can play as Zero. It's a lengthy game. A lot of graphical effects. Awesome game. Metal Combat, Falcon's Revenge. This game is the sequel for Battle Clash. It again uses the Super Scope. I think this is actually the last game to use the Super Scope. It's a more advanced giant mech, first-person shooter game. Awesome. The Legend of the Mystical Ninja. This is the first game in the Garden by Goemon games to be translated, and it's the only Super Nintendo game out of, I think there were 4, correct me if I'm wrong on that, I think there were 4 Super Famicom games. This is the only one to get a North American release. This is the first one. Pretty cool game. Another rare game, this is Ninja Gaiden Trilogy. This is the 3 Ninja Gaiden games for the NES released for the Super Nintendo, with minor colorization updates, and but Otherwise, they're pretty much the NES games on Super Nintendo, all 3 in 1. This game goes for about $100 or more. You know, this is for sale. I don't actually want it anymore, so if you want it, drop me a PM and give an offer. I have it complete in box, manual, box, case, everything. Okay, moving on. Pilot Wings. Gotta love this game. Classic launch title for the Super Nintendo, showed off the Mode 7 capabilities of the Super Nintendo. Pilot Wings how'd you do a whole bunch of stuff. Had a weird combat simulation thing at the end of the game, very strange. One of the classic Super Nintendo games. Everyone should own this game. RoboCop versus Terminator. Yeah, that's right, that exists. Not nearly as violent and hard as the Sega Genesis game, but the Super Nintendo version is pretty good in its own right. Super Famicom game here is Rockman and Forte. Rockman and Forte is the follow-up for Mega Man 8. It was only released in Japan in 1998 for the Super Famicom, which is pretty crazy. The game was later released in 2002 in Japan for the Game Boy Advance, and I believe that came to the North America sometime later after that. Mega Man and Bass, it was called. Rockman and Forte in Japan. Run Saber. Run Saber is basically Strider for the Super Nintendo, made by Atlas. It's got pretty awesome music, pretty rudimentary story, you know, kind of Captain Planet sort of esque thing, you know, events like evil polluters destroying the galaxy or something. Anyway, it's Strider for Super Nintendo. That's all you need to know. SimCity. Now this game was my first introduction to the series. I've since played SimCity 2000 and 3000 for the PC. This one is a lot less complicated. It's a very good entry game for the series. Anybody interested in Will Wright's first Sim games. SimCity for the Super Nintendo. This game is on the Wii Virtual Console, by the way, so you don't have to pick up the Super Nintendo version if you don't want to. Star Fox. The classic Super FX game, the game that allowed the Super Nintendo to be in 3D, but very primitive. Yeah, Super FX Star Fox. Then I have a reproduction of the unreleased Star Fox 2. Star Fox 2 uses a Super FX 2 chip that Yoshi's Island used. It's a pretty amazing game. If you can, get a hold of this game. Reproduction only. Star Trek, Starfleet Academy, Starship Bridge Simulator. Now this is not nearly as good as the PC version, obviously, but the Super Nintendo version is not that bad either. You know, you can play as an ensign training in Starship Command. Kind of awesome. Another Star Trek game. Here is Star Trek Deep Space, or Star Trek: The Next Generation. Star Trek: The Next Generation is basically a very different game than the Sega Genesis version. The Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis versions share the same name, but they're totally different games. And some people prefer the Super Nintendo, and some people prefer the Sega Genesis. I never had the Sega Genesis version, so the Super Nintendo version is the only one I know. So, yeah. This is Star Trek: The Next Generation, Futures Past. Another Star Trek game I have here is Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Crossroads of Time. This game is basically a platformer. How do you make a Star Trek platformer? Well, they did, and it's not very good. Pass on this one. Here is Super Famicom Wars. This is the sequel to Famicom Wars, only released in Japan for the Super Famicom data cartridge, which I'll open this up to show you guys. This is what it looks like. Completely white cartridge, Super Famicom data cartridge it was called. Each one of these blocks would hold memory, but Super Famicom Wars took up all of the blocks, so that's why there's nothing on the label. Yeah, This is what it looked like, completely white instead of the usual gray. There we go. Okay, moving on. Here is Super Ghouls and Ghosts. This is basically Ghosts and Goblins for the Super Nintendo. Extremely hard. A classic Super Nintendo game. Here is Super Mario All-Stars. This contains Super Mario Bros. 1, 2, 3, and Super Mario Bros. 2 in Japan. Kind of awesome. Super Mario RPG, Legend of the Seven Stars. One of the best Super Nintendo games, one of the last Super Nintendo games. It's awesome. Square made this, believe it or not. Here is Super Mario World. Everybody has to have this game if they have a Super Nintendo. I mean, it's just prerequisite. I mean, this is the killer app Mario game. Super Mario World. You know this game. Super Metroid. Almost as much of a killer app for the Super Nintendo as Mario World is. Super Metroid is basically Metroid advanced so much so that it had to have Super in front of it. This game really is super. Super R-Type. This is R-Type for the Super Nintendo. Not really R-Type or R-Type 2. This is pretty much its own game. Yeah. Early Super Nintendo game. Another super game. Here is Super Bomberman 2. This game is probably the best Bomberman game I've ever played outside of Saturn Bomberman. I mean, it's awesome. Multiplayer, single player, awesome game. Another not really a game, but nevertheless, here is the Super Game Boy. A cartridge that allowed you to play Game Boy games on the Super Nintendo. Sometimes in color, with borders and stuff. Think of this as an early version of the Game Boy Player for the GameCube. Super Scope 6. Super Scope 6 was packing 6 titles for the Super Scope when you bought it. Basically a tech demo game for what the Super Scope could do. Kinda neat. Super Star Wars. Star Wars platformer game. Pretty good. Based on A New Hope. Super Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back. Star Wars platformer game based on, believe it or not, The Empire Strikes Back. And Star Wars Return of the Jedi, or Super Star Wars Return of the Jedi, based on, of course, Return of the Jedi. Platformer. The best version of all 3 games. Super Street Fighter 4. Gotta love this game. It's basically Street Fighter, or not, Super Street Fighter 4. This is actually Super Street Fighter 2. This is the ultimate version of Street Fighter 2. Yeah, the best one for the Super Nintendo. It has the extra characters. It has the fast mode. It's awesome. Super Punch-Out. Now, I don't like this game nearly as much as the original Punch-Out, but it's still a good game. Punch-Out, yeah. Gotta love it. Here's a game I do love. Here is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4, Turtles in Time. I played the crap out of this game when I was younger. Here is Tetris Attack, or Puno de Pon in Japan. Awesome. Tiny Toon Adventures, Buster Bust Loose. This is a Konami game. Awesome game for the Super Nintendo. And here is Yoshi's Island for the Super Nintendo. Now everybody knows this game. It's awesome. Vortex, another Super Famicom game and Super Nintendo game. This game uses the Super FX chip to give it 3D graphics. It's okay. And lastly, The Legend of Zelda, Link to the Past. Now, that was it for my Super Famicom games and Super Nintendo games, so yeah, hope you guys enjoyed. Peace.